And hello to you all.
What's the Jew lawyer doing here?
Not Jewish. And even if I was, what difference would it make?
I meant that as a compliment.
When examining Jewish history, ancient and modern, we cannot miss the existence of a perplexing quality to the Jewish story. That is eternality. Of course, this is not exactly true, Of course, humans in general have a beginning and an end, both as individuals and groups. But any group of people who identify as a collectivity, whether religious or national, derive their identity from a certain story or perhaps a myth. And if that story confers a certain quality, these people tend to act according to that quality and create their consciousness based on it. So what do I mean by Jewish eternality? And what is it about Jewish people that has preserved them through all the gruesome adversities that they endured throughout their history and has set them apart from the rest of our species in almost every field out there? How did a group whose worldwide presence amount to a mere 0.2% of the human population be able to garner more than 20% of all Nobel Prizes and has given us some of the greatest names in science, philosophy, art, have built some of the greatest and most influential business empires in the modern world, and laid the ideas on which every modern civilization, especially Western civilization, is built? Many, if not most of these people were never very religious. Some are even atheists, but they nevertheless belong to the Jewish identity by some degree. As an Egyptian, I do not believe in Horus or Ra, but that does not change the fact that the history of the pharaohs played a huge role in shaping my self-identity. What distinguishes Jewish history from that of any nation, though, is its alluring continuity. Most accounts of ancient history are pretty vague and lacking in detail. We know bits and pieces about the kings of ancient Egypt and Babylonia, and we know just as much about the lives of the great Greek philosophers. The everyday person, however, the average Joe, is always faded out from accounts of ancient history. All of these shortcomings do not exist in the Jewish case, though. The children of Israel all mattered equally. They were all God's children. The prophets mostly came from meek backgrounds, but they all left their mark on the Jewish experience. These prophets were all historians, and in a sense, a Jewish prophet was not necessarily one who communicated with God, but one who looked at the past and the present and be able to prophesy the future. Even the one who supposedly talked to God, Moses, had to gain the approval of his Jewish brethren before the 10 Commandments were accepted. Most importantly, because the bigger part of Jewish history did not include any centralized political authority, and because of the coherence of the Jewish people, their history was only added to, and any alterations and the regular demonization of past leaders that ruined most historical accounts were very minor in the Jewish case. In my opinion, Judaism was not only so tightly intertwined with history, but was rather a cult of history. But we'll get to that later on. Before getting into the perplexing forms of Jewish survival, let's take brief leaps together through the pivotal points of the Jewish story with both its mythical and historical elements. Since the theology of Judaism is not my concern here, let's step over the early phases of the creation of mankind and what followed it, and get right to the inception of the Jewish line through the man who is considered to be the first Jew, Abraham. The Jewish story tells us that Abraham was chosen by God to be the forefather of God's chosen people, and through his covenant with God, his descendants would be forever under God's protection as long as they honored that agreement. From here the Jewish legend begins, and from that point, the first modern monotheistic religion was born with a set of ideals that were almost completely new to mankind. Before that, the religion of every nation was traditionally based on the deification of the natural phenomena that they most cherished or dreaded, and worship was done through idols and mediators, who were often the kings themselves. Judaism brought the possibility of direct man-to-God communication, and that concept alone was to totally alter the value of human beings and to introduce a level of liberty that was previously unheard of. From Abraham came Isaac, and from Isaac came Jacob, who later in his life would come to be known as Israel, which means he who striveth with God, and with whom the Jewish people would identify until this day. After Abraham's migration to Canaan, his grandson Jacob would later send his sons to Egypt after a famine had struck their homeland. In Egypt, Jacob's long-lost son, Joseph, had by that time become the ruler of Egypt, and upon his family's arrival in the country, he granted them settlement there. For over a century, the Jewish family, which had now grown to become a community, would live in Egypt, but under the rule of the pharaohs, their circumstances would only grow harsher. Moses, perhaps the absolute most influential character in Jewish history, would lead the enslaved Jewish people out of Egypt, and for 40 years they would walk through Egypt's vast eastern desert. During that time, the Ten Commandments would be declared at Mount Sinai, and the ideals conveyed in these commandments would remain the basis on which the prevalent moral and legal codes are formulated up until this very day. After crossing the Red Sea, the Jewish people would settle in what they came to call Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel. After a period without authority, David became the first king to the kingdom of Israel. He was followed by his son Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem. 33 years later, the Jewish nation would be divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The Jews of the north were the first to taste the bitterness of exile when they were sent to Assyria in 720 BCE. The Babylonian expedition led by Nebuchadnezzar came in 586 BCE and demolished the Jewish people's holiest place on earth, the temple. After conquering Israel, the Babylonians would send the Jewish people en masse into exile in Babylonia, a period known as the Babylonian captivity. After the Persians were able to seize the land from the Babylonians, the Jewish people were allowed by the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great to return to their homeland in 538 BCE, and the Second Temple was built in 515 BCE. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great came, and the Hellenic Empire managed to seize Eretz Israel from the hands of the Persians. Unlike the Persians, however, the Greeks found in Judaism a threat to their pagan faith, and so during their reign over the Jewish people, they made the erasure of the Jewish culture one of their top priorities. These attempts triggered recurrent Jewish revolts against Hellenic rule, most famous of which was the Maccabean revolt that lasted 7 years from 167 to 160 BCE, that targeted the Greek king Antiochus, who had turned the Holy Temple into a pagan shrine. The success of this revolt and the rededication of the temple for Jewish worship are what gave birth to the Hanukkah festival. The temple was to be demolished once again, this time under the command of the Roman general Titus. Following the Roman conquest of Judea and Jerusalem, the period of Roman exile began, as many Jewish people, including some of the leaders who are still alive, were sent to Rome as slaves. Jerusalem, or Yerushalayim, was renamed Elia Capitolina. The rulings of the Torah and the Hebrew calendar were prohibited, and the Roman Emperor Hadrian installed a statue of himself and another of the Roman pagan god Jupiter right at the spot where the Holy Temple once stood. The land of Judea was renamed Palestina, a name derived from the Philistines, who were sworn enemies of the Jewish people. Eretz Israel would then fall under Muslim conquest in the 7th century and would not come under Jewish sovereignty once again until the 20th century. Having lost the land of Judaism, the Jewish people carried and preserved their tradition through the Bible as they went scattered around the globe. During the Middle Ages, the Jewish people were divided into the groupings by which we know them today: the Ashkenazim, who lived in North and Eastern Europe, and the Sephardim, who lived in Portugal, Spain, which was at that time under Islamic rule, and the Middle East and North Africa. In almost every place where the Jewish people existed, they were subject to the harshest forms of persecution. They were expelled from England and France in the late 13th century. When the Black Plague struck Europe in the 14th century, killing almost half of the European population, the Jewish people were blamed for it, and massacres were launched against them across the continent, claiming the lives of thousands of Jews. They were expelled from Spain in the late 15th century, and in 17th century Ukraine, they were targeted by mass murders that wiped out 100,000 to 300,000 Jewish people. The only country where the Jewish people enjoyed some safety and freedom was Poland, where the General Charter of Jewish Liberties of 1264 offered them legal autonomy, a separate tribunal system, and most importantly, protection from the waves of forced baptism that were prevalent elsewhere in Europe. When many Jews fled persecution in Western Europe following the Black Plague, Poland was the refuge. Such liberties were not to be given to the Jews anywhere else in Europe until the late 18th century, more than half a millennium after the Polish Charter. That step was taken by Napoleon in 1791 following the French Revolution and became known as the Jewish Emancipation. The rest of Western Europe gradually followed course until it was finally offered to Russia's Jews by 1917. But in Russia, this only came after a series of horrendous pogroms that had begun in 1881 and resulted in tens of thousands of deaths among Russian Jews. As these pogroms began, the largest migration of Jews in history took place in the year 1882, when 2 million Russian Jews fled the country, most of whom headed to the US and Western Europe, while a small portion migrated to Ottoman-ruled Palestine in what was named the First Aliyah. As the era of emancipation took off in Europe during the 19th century, many Jewish people had a renewed hope that perhaps they would finally be accepted as citizens in the countries they lived in. That led them to start letting go of any rigid elements of their Judaic culture that might come in the way, and the dream of returning to the land of Israel made way to new loyalties as the Reformed Jews in Germany started declaring that, quote-unquote, Berlin is our New Jerusalem. For the first time, it became normal to hear a French Jew identify as French rather than Jewish. The hostility towards the Jewish people was also starting to gradually fade away, or so it appeared. In 1894, in what came to be known as the Dreyfus Affair, the only Jewish officer in the French General Staff, Alfred Dreyfus, was unjustly put on trial. As nationalism had become the new thing by that time, Dreyfus was not tried for the traditional religious charges that were cast at Jewish people in the past, like deicide, for example, the murder of Christ. This time it was the charge of treason. By that time, a new form of hatred for Jews was materializing, and to fit the nationalistic trend, it was also national in nature. That was anti-Semitism. Instead of being despised for their religion, now they were being labeled as racially inferior, and that their true loyalty will never be for Europe, but will remain directed to the East, to Israel, no matter how much they claimed otherwise. The failure of assimilation prompted the Jewish people to start looking for new ways out of their apparently unsolvable situation in Europe. It was in the late 19th century that the Jewish people's exceptional survival instinct and their capability to thrive and influence in the midst of their meekness were to manifest themselves. In the late 19th century, there was a hyper state of intellectuality shaping up on the Jewish front, and despite the polar differences in the ideologies that emerged, they all shared one aim: reinventing the Jewish person. Triggered by the Dreyfus Affair, a young assimilated Austrian Jewish journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl started seeking answers to the Jewish question. At first, he suggested a mass conversion to Christianity, but then realized with the rise of anti-Semitism that since the Jewish people have come to be viewed as a nation, regardless of their religion, their conversion to Christianity would not really wipe out the suspicions directed towards them. He decided to bring the Jewish people into unity once more, but instead of rallying them behind the Judaic religion for which they had sacrificed tens of thousands of their dear lives, being himself an atheist, he decided to make the establishment of a Jewish homeland his core priority. As many of you probably know, before the British Balfour Declaration promised the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine, a piece of land in modern-day Kenya was proposed at first to be home to the Jewish state, but was unaccepted by the more hardline Zionists who insisted on returning the Jewish people to their ancient homeland in the original Zion. Other Jewish people saw a different solution to their problem in socialism. 3 brands of socialism were developed, namely Marxism, Labor Zionism, and Bundism. All 3 rose from the Jewish people's struggle to find a way out of their dilemma. Karl Marx was a German scholar of Jewish origins, but he was what some might call a self-hating Jew. Marx deeply despised Judaic culture in particular and nationalism and religion in general, and so he distanced himself in every way from any attempts at finding an exclusively Jewish solution. He believed that the solution to all forms of injustice had to be international, and it had to rise from the proletariat all around the world regardless of their national or religious backgrounds. Labor Zionism was founded by Moses Hess, a French Jew, and Nachman Syrkin, a Russian Jew. They carried the same communal and egalitarian tenets of Marxist socialism, but only cared about applying them among the Jewish working classes after the return of the Jewish people from the diaspora to their ancient homeland. The third brand of socialism, Bundism, was more Eurocentric than the other two. It emerged from Russia under the banners of the General Jewish Workers' Union, adopted Yiddish as its official language, and aimed at bringing together the workers of Eastern Europe, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Basically, instead of the Polish worker hating the Jewish worker, they can come together and hate their capitalist exploiters. Out of the three brands, Marxism gave rise to one of the largest empires in modern history, the Soviet Union, and Labor Zionism shaped the core economic structure on which the Jewish settlements in Palestine and later in the Jewish state were both based, the kibbutzim and the moshavim communal agricultural systems. As the 20th century began, Jewish migration to Palestine was starting to gain some pace, and it was apparent that the idea of establishing a homeland was rising to popularity among the Jewish people of Europe. In the meantime, the Jews who had traveled to the United States had managed to maintain a stable status in the country. They were blending into the American society and were able to seize the opportunities that the US was offering them in order to grow and flourish. By the year 1933, an evil yet enormous force was on the rise in Germany, a force that would trigger a reshaping of the entire world order, and the Jewish people were its arch enemy, and the destruction of anything they ever stood for was its foremost motive. Before getting into the climax of the Nazi rivalry with Judaism that manifested itself in the Second World War and the Holocaust, let me provide you with some context to that rivalry. Whoever thinks that Nazis' hatred for the Jewish people was only based on their inferiority as a race is missing the bigger part of the story, and is not aware of the enormity of Jewish influence over modern civilization. Nazism was wholeheartedly opposed to what Western civilization had come to, namely the values of liberalism and equality that were starting to prevail in Western Europe and more so in the United States. And so, it aimed at plucking these ideals by the roots. And where were those roots? In Judaism. I mentioned in the beginning how pagan culture centered on the worship of nature, and with that came a respect for its laws. The one supreme law of nature, of course, is survival of the fittest. When the Jewish religion came, it denied the divinity of nature and considered that all these natural phenomena were merely the creation of something way greater, more powerful and non-materialistic. This new God commanded the abandonment of the primitiveness of nature and the replacement of its laws by the rule of a wholly new set of laws, which conferred equality and justice. By looking at it from a secular viewpoint, one could infer that the God that the Judaic religion referred to was history, or more accurately, time. He surpasses nature, he gave rise to its phenomena, and he pushes his creatures to adopting new rules, thus creating progress. Paganism came into clash with Judaism over several episodes and under various names, once by the Egyptians, then by the Babylonians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, and then finally by the Nazis, who despite not being religious in nature like the precursors, shared the same reverence of nature and its laws, but now under a nationalist banner. Let's take a look at the map to understand the degree of centrality of Judaism and the Jews to the world's dynamics at the time. The United States was a country based completely on a modernized version of the Jewish model, enhanced by elements of Roman civilization. The ideals written in the US Constitution were derived almost identically from the rules of the Ten Commandments and the Jewish values of social equality, justice, and individual freedom. It was also a nation built on opportunism and social escalation, two values that are deeply entrenched in Jewish culture and Judaic scripture, which itself was written by prophets and told the stories of Jewish rulers like David and Joseph, most of whom had made it from the very bottom. On the other side of the Atlantic was Western Europe, a region long dominated by Christianity, a religion that emerged from the heart of Judaism and adopted its scripture, and that in the modern world was beginning to reinvent itself according to new interpretations of its Judeo-Christian heritage, which remains the core basis on which European culture and its liberal values stand today. Bear in mind that by the 20th century, some of the hugest business and media establishments in both the US and Western Europe belonged to Jewish people, which triggered greater Nazi hostility towards them. On the other side of the European continent was the Soviet Union, a state established solely on its own version of Marxism, whose origins I already talked about. So in a nutshell, the Second World War saw an alliance between the US, the Western European nations, and the Soviet Union, all based on ideas that emerged from among the Jewish people, against the Nazis in Germany, the last incarnation of pagan values in their fight against the Judaic ideals. By the end of the Second World War, and after almost one-third of the Jewish population had been exterminated, the Jewish people rose to create their own state once again, a state which today stands as a regional and global power to be reckoned with. If the Jews were suspected in the past to be the masterminds behind every major global event, today there is way more reason to think so, and ironically, Jewish influence on the world is one thing that the Jewish people, their admirers, and their most sworn enemies all agree upon, with the difference lying only in how each group views that influence. After centuries of meekness and suffering, the status of the Jewish people has never been higher than it is today, both inside Israel and outside. After a century and a half from their search, the new Jew has been invented. No other group of people have ever been so intertwined with the forces of history like the Jews have, suffering their wrath at times and directing them at others, but in all cases lying at the very center of their current. This only gives me more reason to believe that Judaism is a historical cult, and that the covenant they made long ago was a covenant with history, and that the laws they laid down were the laws of history, and so throughout the toughest twists and turns, the Jews have remained history's chosen people.